I want to bring in now a couple of pollsters to talk about this race and many others. Republican pollster Kellyanne Conway and Democratic pollster Mark Penn. Great to have you with us. Which of the governor's races to you all is the most interesting? Kellyanne, start with you.
What's most interesting to me, Shannon, is that when voters go to choose a chief executive, they don't always align with their party. So you see Lee Zeldin in a state, New York, where we've not had a Republican governor in 20-some years, keeping it tight with Kathy Hochul. You see out in Oregon a real fight, and that's a place, Oregon is a deep blue state where we haven't had a Republican governor in 40 years. I'm watching Nevada. There's been outsized attention to Adam Laxalt taking on Catherine Cortez Masto. There's been outsized attention to Carrie Lake and the Senate race there. Governor Sisolak, a Democrat, has presided over this state losing over tens of thousands of businesses that are never coming back after the COVID lockdowns. He got a D for economic development after those lockdowns, and people are very concerned about the education system there. A guy named Joe Lombardo, the Republican nominee, is challenging him. He's a veteran. He was a sheriff of Clark County since 2014, so he's got the law enforcement military background. And he's doing a really good job holding Sisolak responsible for many of the failings in Vegas. Our latest poll shows both of them under 50, but Lombardo gaining, so that's one I'm watching.
What about you, Mark?
Well, there are half a dozen fascinating governor's races, but I zeroed in really on New York because here Joe Biden won by 23 points. Hochul was substantially well ahead, and Zeldin has really focused on a single issue, crime. And I think it's a good demonstration of, can this issue of crime really change politics as we know it, particularly in New York? And look, even if he comes within single digits, I think it will send a message to Democrats. You can't ignore crime, immigration, and inflation, the core issues that people see in their daily lives.
So we've talked about some polls that have shown some really substantial swings, and whether it's the methodology of the poll, if it's spot on, I don't know. But let's talk about one that showed up in the Wall Street Journal this week. It finds that white women living in suburban areas who make up 20% of the electorate now favor Republicans for Congress by 15 percentage points, moving 27 percentage points away from Democrats since the Journal's August poll. Mark, is it an outlier? Is it accurate, whether you want to believe it or not?
No, you see, actually, most people don't realize that those voters, say in the Romney election or most presidential elections, voted solidly Republican. And the impression was that they didn't. And when actually the Democrats made headway on them, you know, in the last midterms, that actually was the story. The fact that they've bounced back, and they typically are more interested in how do we protect our kids, crime, inflation, economic issues, how am I going to put food on the table? The fact they've bounced back, that's a very, very significant finding. I believe it's probably true, and it probably will make the biggest difference in this upcoming election.
Yeah, they also say that group is one of the most motivated to get out and vote. Now, something that makes your life tough as pollsters, the Washington Post had a piece that said 95% of Americans do not pick up these calls when they get them. I don't know about you guys, but if I don't recognize the number, I don't pick up these calls either. But the New York Times had this piece this week that said this idea of non-responsive bias. They said in 2020, white registered Democrats were more than 20% likelier to respond to surveys than white registered Republicans. That hallmark of non-response bias looks as if it's back. Overall, white registered Democrats were 28% likelier to respond to our Senate polls than Republicans. How tough, Kellyanne, does this make it for you guys to do your jobs?
It's been tough, but I think that's overstated. And respectfully, I think the New York Times is trying to do a little CYA here. They said Donald Trump had an 8% chance of winning Michigan in 2016, a 15% chance of being the president overall. He won Michigan, became the president. So they're doing this in a way that they can't be wrong. But look, I think there's a way to make people feel comfortable to speak to you. Many Americans do want to express themselves and feel like they're participating and that their voice matters way ahead of the election. I find it to be very dangerous and disappointing to hear a current and a former president and the Democrats out there basically scaring people away from voting. You know, they're all out there saying election deniers, and Americans are looking at them and saying, you're inflation deniers, you're recession deniers, you're rising crime deniers, you're education lost learning and reduced test score deniers. That's why a lot of those women that you talked about are willing to talk to pollsters, are willing to come to the polls and say, look, I'm swinging over, and the issue set is uncomplicated and straightforward. It's inflation, the economy, it's crime, it's immigration, but it's also education. Parents, a year after Glenn Youngkin won that Virginia race and Jack Cherry came close in New Jersey, Shannon and Mark, parents are still parents. They're still upset about what they see as a hangover from all the lost learning and test scores. And they don't understand why, even though kids are back on campus and in the classrooms, that the left seems to be attacking the curriculum instead of attacking the lost learning issues.
And Mark, you wrote a piece a week or two ago on FoxNews.com that talked about inflation and those voters who care about the economy the most. You warned that it's going to come back to bite the Democrats.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's the number one issue in the country. And the fascinating thing to me is that the Democrats have said threat to democracy is really what they're running this campaign on. You know, I think the Biden administration did threat to democracy. They did student loans. They did marijuana pardons, right? And they did $1 million of gas out of the petroleum reserve. They did not confront these issues directly in any meaningful way. They became inflation deniers. And that really, I think, is a stupid strategy. We're going to see whether or not I'm right, and that was probably one of the worst strategies I've ever seen in a midterm, or they were right. They had some tough issues, and they decided to completely avoid them.
The president's final speech, if we think, if we look at, primetime big speeches where he's calling the nation to pay attention, it wasn't about the economy. I mean, the closing argument was much more about the divisive issues, and it sounded like it was aimed at people that were probably already going to vote Democrat anyway. A missed opportunity?
Or may actually have voted in early voting. I think that the Democrats have an advantage in early voting. They've banked some of those early votes. Probably a lot of pro-choice voters went out early. And it's just the wrong message for this country. And even as the Democrats in those closing days, Shannon, expanded the number of messengers, they never got to the core message that is animating and motivating Americans to the polls. People feel like they're drowning economically, and they're looking for pockets of air. This is why you're going to have a good Republican night on Tuesday. And I think it's going to be a governing majority and a realignment for Hispanic voters and female voters who say, I gave the Democrats a chance. They've just ignored me. Ignoring the will of the voters and insulting half of the country is no way. I think that the Democrats have enraged people. That's their strategy. Republicans have engaged people. They've had 100 million voter contacts, 1 million volunteers, and they've opened 38 community centers through the RNC where you can go into your community and find out what the difference between a Republican and Democrat is. I'd rather engage than enrage people. I think enraging is a failed strategy.
We'll see what works on Tuesday night and in the probably days and weeks and maybe months to follow. Thank you both. Great to have you there. Kellyanne and Mark Penn, thank you.